We are proud members of the Spy Podcast Network. Find out more at www.spypodcasts.com.
Hello and welcome to Spy Hard's podcast, where your hosts go deep undercover into the world of spy movies to decipher which films make the knock list. But remember, this information is strictly for your ears only. I'm James Bond.
And I'm Jimmy Bond, the provocateur.
And, well, we've got a bit of a task ahead of ourselves this week, Cam. We haven't introduced a movie yet, but I think to get through it, we need to assemble a team of Bonds. A team of Bond experts. And so we've called in two previous guests, and I've been assured that they have done their exercises, they've stood on their head, they've had some royal jelly and washed their intestines. Joining us firstly, back on the show, it is the writer of the James Bond Lexicon and the co-host of the On Her Majesty's Secret podcast. It is Mr. Alan J. Porter. How are you doing, Alan?
I'm doing fine, thank you. I have been out and fed the lions as well, and obviously, watered the Black Rose. So, excellent album from Thin Lizzy, by the way. Black Rose.
Well, and to introduce his partner in crime on this episode, to really help us bring it home, it is the creator of the Licensed to Queer blog and podcast, previous guest on the show, Mr. David Lowbridge-Ellis. Hello, David.
Good evening, everybody. I have to say I've checked your credentials in a Parisian pissoir, and I think we're ready to go.
There's so much to do here today. I don't know how we're going to get through this. I can see David's already on the martini. I wish I'd done the same thing. But, gents, I mean, thank you both for coming back on the show. Now, Alan, you joined us to talk about the Flint films.
Correct, yeah.
A while back. But how have you been since? What's been going on with you?
I'm doing great, thank you. Just hanging out, doing stuff, podcasting and talking Bond and writing other stuff and working on a novel. So yeah, and of course the day job. So yeah, been pretty busy. And that's about it, really.
Well, never worry about that day job too much. Just focus on the Bond. That's why we're here, of course.
Of course.
Of course. And David, how about you? What's new?
Yeah, so the day job's been kind of intense, but that just makes me kind of redouble my efforts, really, on Licensed to Queer as a kind of escape, really. So since we last spoke, it was the Bourne Supremacy episode, wasn't it? So
certainly was. You were our second guest ever.
Wow. So, since then, I've had a lot of contributors on the website, so it's not just me writing for it now. There's probably about 15 people who've written various different things, and I've, appeared on lots of other people's podcasts and things like that. So I'm trying to get as many different perspectives on Bond as possible. So that's kind of fitting for Casino Royale, really, because, the general idea being that, anyone can be James Bond, and it turns out that lots of different people love lots of different things about James Bond.
Well, it's a funny factoid, but I've seen you in person, David, more recently than I've seen Cam.
That's true.
Oh my gosh.
Well, I mean, is it that crazy?
It's not a bad thing for me, to be honest with you. Distance helps when it comes to me and Cam.
That's right. I'm trying to find other contributors to take my place more often so that I can spend less time in the presence of Scott.
But Cam, I think without further ado, what are we talking about this week?
We are tackling the 1967 adaptation of Casino Royale, starring David Niven, Peter Sellers, Woody Allen, a whole bunch of folks, and directed by a whole bunch of folks, and written by a whole bunch of folks.
I've sent everyone some LSD, so hopefully that will get us through the episode. But I think for some people who have maybe never seen this film, have maybe seen the original, or maybe not even seen, the Daniel Craig version or the one from the 50s, let me read you out the letterboxd.com synopsis for Casino Royale 1967. Casino Royale. Casino Royale is too much for one James Bond. Sir James Bond is called back out of retirement to stop Smersh. In order to trick Smersh, James thinks up the ultimate plan, that every agent will be named James Bond. One of the Bonds, whose real name is Evelyn Tremble, is sent to take on Le Chiffre in a game of baccarat, but all the Bonds get more than they can handle.
I mean, if I were asked to sum up the plot of Casino Royale 67 in a few sentences, this human being out there, I bow down to them. They did their best. They came somewhat close, and that is about as close as you can get.
I don't know what else I would have done with it, to be fair, but I'm interested to hear from our guests. I'll talk about Cam and I's experiences with the film in a minute, but David, to you first. When did you first stumble drunkenly into the arms of Casino Royale 67?
Well, I hope I wasn't drunk because I think I was about 7.
Ah.
So I rented this from the local library where it was like £1 for rentals. My family didn't rent videos very often, and I think it's because my parents just didn't want to pay the rental fee, to be honest. But the library was fine, so I remember renting it from the library, thinking, oh, it's just another James Bond film, and then getting it home on VHS and watching it and thinking, it's not quite just another James Bond film, is it? But having said that, it was still James Bond, and I didn't know anything about, the rights issues, and I'm sure we'll get into this, but this is just as official as, the other James Bonds. But to me, it obviously felt very different. I think I watched it at the same time. It was either just before or just after On Her Majesty's Secret Service. And that also felt quite strange in a way, because it is something of a departure. Obviously not quite as strange, but I found it fascinating as a child, to be honest. I didn't realise growing up, then obviously social media wasn't a thing, and 7-year-old doesn't tend to read an awful lot of in-depth film criticism, but I didn't really kind of hate it like a lot of people do. I just thought it was a bit weird. But then again, a lot of Bond films are weird, and the plots don't really make an awful lot of sense once you try to stretch them out, so to me it didn't appear that different.
Are you saying the Fabergé egg plot in Octopussy doesn't make complete sense?
You mean it makes even less sense, the Fabergé plot, than the, Living Daylights, phony defection to be able to smuggle diamonds to be able to buy heroin. Oh my god, yeah, exactly.
Well, I can only assume that your parents weren't renting videos because they were too busy getting you to practice Debussy on the piano.
No, I'm afraid Debussy is something that I did not indulge in as a child. Although I am quite partial nowadays to Lapsang Souchong tea.
It's actually quite nice too.
So I've definitely got that in common with Sir James.
Oh, Alan, what about you? What was your first foray into Casino Royale 67?
I was a little older than David, but there was no drink involved. Actually, my first encounter with it was on an album of James Bond theme tunes, a Jeff Love and his big band orchestra cheap album that I bought, I think, when I was like 14 or 15. Came out in 75, so yeah, I'd have been 14 or 15. Which was him covering all the Bond theme tunes, and there was one on there with a track that was like this really great poppy, really nice tune with the title Casino Royale, and I'm going, there's been no Bond movie called Casino Royale. I have no idea what that is. And I must have mentioned it to my father because he was a huge Peter Sellers fan, like with the Goons and everything. He adored everything Peter Sellers did, and he was like, "Oh, that's a Peter Sellers movie." And then the next time it came on TV, he sat me down and was like, "Okay, this is the Peter Sellers Casino Royale. We're going to watch it." And so I think that was my first exposure to it. I really thought it was a whole bunch of fun, and it was a riot. And I think once it came out on video, I think it was one of the first video when we got a VCR. I think it was one of the first videos I bought, and I know it's one of the first when it came out on DVD. And I switched everything to DVD. It's one of the first DVDs I bought because I actually watching it the other night, and actually looked at the back of my DVD case, and it's a DVD from 2002. So it's one of the earliest DVDs I bought, and I've probably watched it once every couple of years ever since. And I just find it a good, fun, light movie to watch with a good, a martini or a glass of wine, and just kick back and just let it flow over me. There's so much to enjoy in it. So.
Well, I want to draw back actually on something that David said real quickly, and just sort of to lay it out, because some people will like to say that this isn't a Bond film, and I'm just gonna say you're wrong at this point. I think we could all agree here that this is a James Bond film.
Well, it features James Bond, but it doesn't. I don't know. Again, it's not really canon with like other Bond, but I guess it could be because it's set far enough in the future with an elderly Bond. I don't know.
Yeah, but there's no such thing as canon in the Bond movies anyway. The continuity is so loose
that's
between.
True.
But to get to David's point, as he mentioned, this is unofficial. I hate it when people say this and never say never are unofficial movies, because they're not. They were officially licensed. They were licensed from the Ian Fleming estate. They had the rights. It's an official James Bond movie, period.
The man who wrote the lexicon has spoken. I think that's the gospel right there. I can't argue. And I won't, because I agree with it. But it's interesting that you both experienced this film at a very, well, not very young age, but between the two of you, relatively young. Cam, what about you?
I obviously, as a kid, watched all the Bond movies and I was obsessed. And at a certain point, I became aware of this movie. And I remember asking my mom about it. I said, is there because it was not something that I don't think was available to rent at our video store. And so I asked her about it. And she goes, oh, it's terrible. It's just a bad spoof movie. Don't bother. So I really was like, okay, cool. I guess it's not a real Bond movie. But I was aware of, spoofs at that point, because I would have seen things like Naked Gun, maybe some of the Hot Shots movies, things like that. So Spaceballs for sure. And it just kind of got kicked down the road. And then when I was in my early 20s, maybe late teens, I went to the library, like David, and they had a copy of Casino Royale. And I was like, okay, I've watched all the Bonds multiple numbers of times. This is kind of like the lost Bond film I've never gotten to see. At the very least, let's see what this is. And I took it home. And, I didn't care for it. I was sitting there going, as someone who, grew up watching a lot of spoof movies, most spoof movies aren't pushing the, 2-hour, 15-minute mark. I was completely confused throughout as to what was going on. Didn't really understand a lot of the humor. And it was pretty much torture, I would say, the first time through. And I would say my opinion of it has been refined over the years. But if you asked 20-year-old Cam, or however old I was, what he thought of Casino Royale 67, it probably would have had expletives filled into the sentence.
I wonder if it still does.
No, it doesn't.
Okay. It's funny then, because by the looks of it, the three of you have all come to this film at quite formative times, early years, sort of teenage years, and in your 20s. I myself watched it for my first time in my 30s. So definitely charting a course there, because as Cam know and some listeners will remember, years back I got a collection of all 24 Bond films at the time, and I hadn't seen some growing up. I'd caught some on bank holidays, but I hadn't caught them all, or I'd caught snippets. And that's kind of where the genesis of this podcast came from, is where I was texting Cam on WhatsApp back and forth as I watched the 24 and made notes and jokes between them. And then I found out that, the two other films that are not in the collections existed. And once I finished those films, I sought those two out and watched them. And I remember just thinking to myself, what a strange oddity this film is. Like, I don't really get it, but I'm sure people got it at the time. But I think this podcast and examining, especially the 60s films that we've come through and discussed so far, has really informed my thoughts on it, which we'll get to in a minute. But at the time, I just dismissed it as a bit of a footnote.
Right. Which, I mean, for a long time, it kind of was regarded. I think it's something that in recent years, a lot of Bond fans have been writing about, like David, and making it more of a presence in pop culture. But for when I was young, this was a movie that no one watched or talked about, at least over here in, my little world of, Vancouver, BC.
So I think we've all got different perspectives going into it before we rewatched it for this and rewatched it recently. So I think before we dig into what we think now, it's clear that I've assembled a group of the finest men that ever breathed. So, Cam, how on earth did we get a Casino Royale film in 1967?
Well, does anyone have 3 hours to break down the making of Casino Royale 67?
It's 2 podcasts. It's 2 whole episodes, isn't it, really?
Yeah, we're going to do somewhat of the abbreviated version, but Alan, I know you've done a lot of research on the making of this, so feel free to chime in with any clarifications or anything you think is important along the way. This was essentially the brainchild of producer Charles K. Feldman, who had made the film What's New, Pussycat in 1965, and that was a hit film. Has anyone seen What's New, Pussycat?
I'm afraid so.
Yes.
Yeah, I hated it.
Same.
I watched it as research for the piece I eventually wrote on Casino Royale 67. I was just like, this is just not funny. Yeah.
The best bit is the Tom Jones theme tune that you hear a snap of.
Absolutely. It's so bad.
Yeah. Yes, it's a Peter Sellers, Woody Allen comedy? Question mark. It's a real chore.
With Ursula Andress as well.
Yep. It's a real chore to sit through, but it was a hit movie.
Even in the Blu-ray version I've got, the like booklet that you get with it says it's a terrible film, and the critic says the reason why it's so bad is because an Englishman who is a sexual titan is not a tried and tested character trope. James Bond, yes, but not in a comedy. And I think that hits the nail on the head. You know, I mean, it's pretty offensive to, you know, the Englishmen in this crowd that we can't be sexual titans. But I think that's the reason why it's just so. Even though I love his name's just got out of my head. Lawrence of Arabia. Help. Actor's name.
Oh, Peter O'Toole?
Peter O'Toole, thank you. Who obviously appears in Casino Royale 67 in a bizarre callback to that movie, which makes no flipping sense at all. But I love Peter O'Toole, but I hated that film so much.
Yep, that pretty much sums up my experience. Scott, that's not a recommendation, I guess, for you.
I think I've lived through it vicariously through you three just there. I think that's all I need to know.
Yeah. So Feldman had inherited the rights to the Casino Royale novel by Ian Fleming from a director-producer, Gregory Radoff, who had purchased them back in the 1950s from Fleming for $6,000. And he'd passed away, and the rights had wound up with Feldman. And they flirted with doing a more serious take on Casino Royale. They had Ben Hecht, the writer of many classic films, including Notorious, handling, scripting, and he went through a few drafts. There was even one where it was a version of Casino Royale, very, pretty much following the novel, but it didn't feature James Bond. It featured an American gangster named Lucky Fortunato, which, I mean, in an alternate world, I would love for that movie to exist. I would love to have the Lucky Fortunato James Bond film.
Can I just add to that? Yeah, one of the quotes I saw doing the research is that those Hecht things are probably, and I'm quoting here, the most brutal James Bond screenplays ever written. Very dark, heavy on sex and violence.
Yeah.
So Paul Verhoeven would be happy with them then.
Yeah, he would. Yeah, he would like those. Yeah.
Yes, and Feldman did try to pair up with Eon to make an official adaptation of Casino Royale, but they just weren't interested in working with him. And Hecht did also do other adaptations. There was one that is apparently closer to the book, but spins off in a few different directions, and it was quite, as Alan said, much darker. And apparently, Hecht handed in his final draft of Casino Royale 2 days before a fatal heart attack in 1964. So those drafts never wound up in the final film, but there was one thing they did introduce, which was the James Bond codename theory, which was something that Hecht worked into one of his drafts, that they decided, okay, we can use that, and let's just try to satirize the entire 60s spy craze, because, spoofs were a big deal, and James Bond is a big deal, so why not try to combine those two things?
So just to jump in.
Yeah.
Just to sort of maybe put it in its time and place, this wouldn't be the first spoof of a Bond film, though, because we would have had the Flint Spy at this point, at least the first one.
And I think Get Smart was on the air, too.
So it's not that revolutionary either.
No.
Weird. Like, to be fair, that script was written in 64, and this film came out in 67, so there is a good 3-year difference here.
Yeah, and I did see this quote tossed around, which I thought was really strange, where they believed at the time Saltzman and Broccoli had already used everything in the novel except for the Baccarat, so they decided to just structure the entire movie around that. That doesn't make any sense to me. There's a lot of elements in the story of Casino Royale that Saltzman and Broccoli had never used.
I don't remember the ball torture scene in Goldfinger.
Yeah, you got that Vesper.
Well, it's sort of the testicle torture is a thread through the whole of Bond, though, isn't it? Because you've got his genitalia. I'm choosing my words very carefully here. You've got his genitalia threatened with a laser beam, like it, So there's a whole. I end up writing about castration a lot on the website. I've just done it again for what I'm writing, and I'm just like, oh my god, people are going to think I'm obsessed. But clearly, Fleming was obsessed.
Yeah. My understanding with the switch from the serious to the comedy was after they saw Dr. No, after Feldman saw Dr. No, he realized there was no point in going head to head with Eon.
Mm-hmm.
So that's when he decided, well, let's go the other direction and make it a So I think they were thinking about it being a spoof as early as Dr. No.
Right.
When none of the other spoofs had actually come up. So I think it was done in parallel. It was just the amount of time it took to get into production was why it ended up coming out so many years later. So.
Right. I mean, it's interesting. I read multiple behind the scenes on this, and like from legit sources, and it's interesting how often they contradict each other.
Yeah, there's no real clear picture of what happened with this movie.
No.
Which is an interesting thing that to bring it up, because Alan, you're currently working on a bit of a book on this film, I hear.
I'm hoping to. Yes, I have a. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to plug it. But yes, I have a pitch that is circulating for a book around the sort of cultural history of Casino Royale. There's already an excellent making of book out there, which is very much a step to step how it went through the making of the movie. But I'm hoping to do something that's more around why it got made and its reaction. And then we've talked about this already, its sort of resurgence as a cult movie and all the attention it gets and why it now gets that attention, and its place in sort of modern pop culture and its influences. So yeah, that is currently going the rounds. So if there's any publisher out there who's interested, just reach out. You can find me on Twitter at Bond Lexicon or through the contact page at bondlexicon.online. I would love to.
I love it.
Love for somebody to who would love to publish it, and then we can really get deep and working on it. But yes, I am currently doing a lot of background research.
I love a good plug. Go on, Cam.
Checks in the mail. Checks in the mail, Scott.
So Feldman was initially looking at maybe trying to bring Connery over. They also looked at Shirley MacLaine to star. That never panned out. They also looked at a couple of directors like Brian Forbes, who'd done Guns of Navarone, and Clive Donner, who had directed What's New, Pussycat. And none of these talks really seemed to go anywhere. And so they decided to go with several directors and approach it with sort of an anthology concept idea. And so you have your group of five. You had, Val Guest, who had written and directed The Day the Earth Caught Fire, as well as Where the Spies Are, which was a David Niven vehicle. You also had Ken Hughes, who had done an adaptation of Human Bondage and would go on to do Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. You had John Huston, the classic American filmmaker who had done films like African Queen and Maltese Falcon. Joseph McGrath, who was mostly known for doing Beatles music videos. He was a Sellers hire. Sellers fought very hard to get him hired on the project. So that's sort of why he was there, because he didn't have a background in major motion pictures. And then just lastly, you had Robert Parish, who was sort of a journeyman director. He'd done a number of films, but he was also an editor. And from what I read, that was very appealing to them because they thought they might need an editor to kind of give them some guidance in assembling all of these distinct visions of the project.
See, and this is where I think Alan's book will come in quite handy, is I heard a completely different version of how the events went down. So that's
interesting.
Because in my book, it was, I think, Joseph McGrath, who filmed a lot of it, or some of the beginning stuff, and then he got fired, it started to crumble, and then they started looking at the extra directors. It wasn't like a pitch from the beginning to have the directors.
Oh, no, that's not my understanding. My understanding is that the original idea was to do like an anthology, where each director was given their own. So one director was going to do a story around the retired James Bond. One was going to do one around a serious James Bond, which was the Terence Cooper character. There was going to be a female Jane Bond. Mm-hmm. They were talking about Jane Bond as early as 1956, so that, nothing's new. So a female James Bond, which was the Shirley MacLaine casting. And then there was going to be one where a croupier, was recruited and given the code name James Bond to go and play the Baccarat game against Le Chiffre. I think that was it. There was originally four things. And then they decided to do the Sir James Bond Vesper Lynn thing as a linking bridge between each of the distinct pieces.
There you go.
So.
That's it corrected. Go on, Cam.
Is it the only example of a portmanteau comedy film? Because obviously portmanteau horror is quite well established. You know, separate episodes linked with a linking narrative. But I could not. I'm sure there is a portmanteau comedy, but I just couldn't think of one.
Yeah, nothing's jumping to mind, but I agree with you. There has to be something out there. It feels like there should be. You know what? There is. Amazon Women on the Moon from 1987. That was one that had like a lot of genre and comedy directors at the time, and it was sort of based around the idea of like watching late night television, where you would switch to different, little short films that would kind of sum up kind of trashy late night TV. So that's the best one I've got off the top of my mind.
I think the question mark is, did it work when we did it in this film, and should we be doing it? So, which we'll answer shortly, I'm sure.
Yeah. And so they were working from a screenplay initially by Wolf Mankiewicz, who had written Where the Spies Are, and also co-written The Day the Earth Caught Fire. He also did work on Dr. No that was uncredited because he was concerned the movie would bomb and he wanted his name taken off of it. Interesting decision there. They also had input from John Law and Michael Sayers, who were TV writers primarily. And for Michael Sayers, this would be his final film credit. And they also had just like a ton of other people writing on this movie. I think Mankiewicz said that by the end there was about 18 names on the writing for this film. And people like Peter Sellers, Joseph Heller, Billy Wilder contributed some ideas, Terry Southern. There was just a ton of people adding elements along the way. So I'm sure with the WGA, this would have been a nightmare.
It already is.
Sure. Ken Hughes said that in regards to the production, and Ken Hughes was one of the directors he did the Berlin scenes primarily. And he said that none of the directors knew what the other one was doing. They had absolutely no idea. And so, again, if you're doing like an Amazon Women on the Moon or something like that, that makes sense. But in a movie where there is like a linear narrative supposed to be carrying this through, that's a bizarre decision, a really bizarre decision.
Yeah, I think the idea to do the linear narrative came later, because I've read that each of the directors was given their portion of the script, but the pages for the other portions were blank. So they weren't allowed to know what the other directors were working on. So,
like, I understand trying to make an artistic film, go avant-garde, and especially in the 60s, you're pushing the boundaries, perhaps. But when you're gambling on a franchise like James Bond, surely you want to go mass appeal, and it's like they're just trying to push their audience away, even at this stage.
Yeah, it's a crazy decision, especially with a property that's fairly new. It's the sort of thing, like if you made Casino Royale 67 in like the 80s or 90s or whatever, people would be like, I know James Bond so well that this makes a lot of sense. But in the 60s, it's rather bold to go in this almost like artsy kind of style. But nonetheless.
Do you think the challenge, this has just occurred to me, but do you think the challenge is not dissimilar to what the Broccolis are going through right now? What identity to give James Bond? Because we've had so many different flavours of Bond. And did they think, because increasingly the Sean Connery movies started semi-seriously, and then Terence Young and Sean Connery thrown in the one-liners in Dr. No, and then that was pushed a little bit from Russia with Love, massively in Goldfinger, and then Thunderball. So it was kind of pushing in that direction. And obviously You Only Live Twice, which was, if I remember correctly, released slightly after this film. Was it? Yeah.
By the way, I saw a great quote the other week that there was two Bond movies released in 1967, and this was the one that was actually closest to the Fleming source material.
It absolutely is. I mean, I'm sure we'll get into that when we look at the characters in a minute.
It's so bizarre when you say that, but it's like, I guess it's true.
It's true, isn't it?
Totally
When you think about it.
It's totally true. And I'm just thinking, if you're making your own Bond picture, how do you differentiate it from the Ian ones? And it's like the direction seems to be just go in every direction possible.
Well, we recently guested on another podcast to talk about Never Say Never Again, and we will be talking about it ourselves later this year. But they had to stick to the Thunderball script more or less, and with their own slight embellishments. But for a film that was trying to distance itself in a way, it really kept on harking back to Thunderball, the film, which was so bizarre. Whereas at least this film is, I suppose, trying to be different.
Oh, it's trying and succeeding at being very different.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they had Peter Sellers on board to, obviously star in this movie, and he was coming off of The Pink Panther and A Shot in the Dark, as well as What's New Pussycat. So he was, really high. His stock was at an all-time high here. And
nice pun.
Thank you. But he was not in the best of straits personal life wise. He'd had a heart attack, and on the set of Casino Royale, he was prone to unpredictable mood swings and violent tantrums. He demanded, for example, a set be destroyed after he had a dream that his mother didn't like it. He also had a complete fear of Orson Welles. The two of them did not get along, and Peter Sellers refused to be in a room with him, and so they had to shoot their scenes kind of separate. And so there was just a lot of awkwardness. He was also prone to disappear from the set, and at one point he disappeared for 3 weeks. And so they basically had to dismiss him and have director Val Guest concoct that whole bizarre race car scene out of just a random bit to explain why he was leaving the movie. And they decided they would boost up the other Bond characters. So, for example, the Mata Bond and Jimmy Bond, Woody Allen character, got boosted up in terms of their screen time to help kind of compensate for losing Peter Sellers along the way.
And it's probably a good time to mention as well, we do have a Spy Master interview coming later this week with Miss Jacqueline Bisset, a.k.a. Miss Goodthighs. And she talks a lot about the sort of Peter Sellers experience, as it were, and things she had to deal with on set with him. And obviously he was definitely going through some things at the time, and potentially dangerous instances occurred on set due to this with him. So yeah, tune into that on Friday. But yeah, a great chat with Jacqueline.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm looking forward to hearing that. But I think part of the problem was also Feldman seemed to be very even scared of Peter Sellers, that he didn't want to upset his star, and he gave Sellers total control over his segments. So, as you said, Sellers renamed the character, rewrote the scripts, brought somebody in literally to do rewrites every day to make sure his lines were funnier than Orson Welles or Woody Allen's that he'd heard. And you talked about the director that he brought on being fired. Well, actually, Sellers fired him after thumped him because he fell out with him and then threw him off the set. And Feldman had to went and bought a Rolls Royce and gave it to the director as an apology for Sellers' behavior. So yeah, and he was disappearing off to Sweden to be with Britt Eklund at the time. And basically his contract, because the movie was running so long, his contract ran out. And Sellers demanded overages. And I think his contract said that basically if the movie went beyond time, he would get paid a week's salary for every day it ran over. But he was the one causing it to run over. So they were like, well, we're not going to invoke that clause. You're out of here. And then, as you said, they just did stuff to cover up the fact that he'd gone missing partway through the production. So.
And so this movie had a $6 million budget that ballooned to $12 million. It doubled. And the finale alone for the movie, the big scene in the Casino Royale where chaos is breaking loose, cost $1 million and took 2 months to shoot. And Richard Talmadge, who was a stuntman and B-movie director, came in, and he's uncredited, but he is one of the co-directors of that sequence. So there's kind of like a sixth director on Casino Royale. But as I said...
Whoa. That scene had a director?
Oh, yeah.
Questionable.
I think it makes a lot of sense, though, that a stunt man would be co-directing that when you see some of the things like, Smokey and the Bandit, some of those 70s comedies that would come later where they would have stuntmen direct them, because it's all just kind of chaos, organized chaos. I don't know if this is so organized, though.
Maybe there was a lot more sense in the 3-hour version.
Maybe.
There's a longer version?
The original cut was 3 hours.
Oh, no.
They cut 45 minutes out of the movie.
A Casino Royale. Oh.
There was also scenes that never got filmed after Sellers went. There was scenes and stuff that was in the screenplay that never got filmed. So.
I can buy that the Sellers stuff missing, but I don't know. Another 45 minutes of this just scares me to my core.
Can I just go back to the budget, Cam?
Yeah.
You mentioned the budget, but some sources actually reckon that Feldman's put in almost as much of his own personal money.
Oh, God.
Like I said, he was buying people Rolls Royces and all sorts of weird stuff. So some of the sources I've seen says the final spend, never mind the budget, the final spend was more around the 20 million mark.
And that's 1967. That's
67
insane.
money, yes.
That's so insane. And I mean, for example, You Only Live Twice cost $9.5 million for comparison.
I was about to ask what were the other ones costing. So yeah, wow, that's and yet this is okay. Yeah, okay.
They built a volcano.
And what did we end up with? A seal with a 007 logo on his neck.
You know what? Not a bad trade-off. I do like the seal.
I do too.
But yeah, so massive budget. Domestically, it did 22.7 million. International, 19 for a worldwide total of 41.7 million. You know, it's they probably kind of broke even on that one. I would have to imagine.
Well, I heard it was a success. Like there was queues around the block. People were clamoring to see the film.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe not after the first time.
Yeah, I'd be very curious if you were to go back to 1967 and see what the word of mouth was like the week to week financial, money coming in on that one. It may have been a bit of a drop off, kind of like a Morbius level drop off.
That joke only lands for you, Cam, I think, because I've not seen it.
No, I've not seen it either.
There you go.
Me either. Sorry.
Okay, well, nonetheless.
Sorry, Jared Leto.
So, as I said, yeah, 41.7 million worldwide. But for comparison, You Only Live Twice did 111.6 that year. So it was the much bigger hit. And the top three for the year, number 1 was The Graduate. Number 2 was The Jungle Book. Number 3 was Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. And just lastly, this movie had an Oscar nomination for Best Song for The Look of Love. This was the first Bond song to get an Oscar nomination. So, the heck with you, Shirley Bassey.
And the first one sung by a queer artist as well, I think. I'm just going through them in my head, but there you go.
Interesting. Okay, yeah, Burt Bacharach.
No.
No, not Burt. Dusty Springfield, sorry. I'm not going to out Burt Bacharach.
Breaking news.
Exclusive, folks.
Right. And so it was nominated. It did not win. I looked up the winner of Best Song that year. It was Talk to the Animals from Dr. Dolittle. So I don't really remember that song. It's crazy, though. Bare Necessities from The Jungle Book was nominated and did not win. I'm like, that probably, if you're looking at it from the point of view of looking backwards, that probably should have won. And also, this had a Grammy nomination for Best Score. It also did not win that.
I will just throw it out there. Maybe we can discuss it in depth later. But it's funny how some of the weird outer edge Bonds, like On Her Majesty's and this, have maybe the best songs. Not Never Say Never Again, obviously. But yeah, On Her Majesty's and this, probably two of the best Bond songs of all time that have also stood the test of time. Because you still hear those on the radio, whereas I don't often hear, I don't know, what was Moonraker's song?
Moonraker.
Oh. Sure. There you go. I don't hear that very often.
So that sort of sums up the car crash of the behind the scenes on Casino Royale 67.
Okay. I mean, that took us 20 minutes. So you can only imagine what's going to happen now when we unleash the reviews of this film. Okay. Guests always go first. David, I'm going to throw it to you. What do you think about Casino Royale 67 in 2022?
I sort of love it. And it's partly because I spent so long in its company. It's about 18 months ago where I decided to do my queer reviews. So if you've ever been on my website, you'll see that I break down a Bond film, not reviewing in a sense of giving it a star rating or something, but kind of seeing how queer it is. And so I break it into different sections: Bond, or in this case, Bonds, and then the villains, the allies, the girls, and then any kind of camp elements, and that's kind of like the kitchen sink, anything left over. And I thought when I started this, I thought, it'll be one of those, because I'm not going to take this one as seriously as the Bond films, which tend to run somewhere between like 5 and 13,000 words. And then I started it, I thought it'll be about 2,000 or 3,000 words, and it ballooned to about 9,500 in the end, because there was just so much to say about it. And I think perhaps taking it in bite-sized chunks is the best way to take this movie, because it is a bit like eating a whole bag of sweets or drinking too much delicious alcohol. Eventually, it kind of becomes a bit tiring and you're overwhelmed with it. So I think breaking it down into chunks made me appreciate it a lot more. I love it for its queer elements. I already mentioned the pissoir. What Bond movie begins with Bond essentially having a gay cruising moment in a public convenience? Well, actually, there are two others. GoldenEye and Casino Royale 2006. Both of them begin with James Bond in a toilet accosting another man. So, it's the first time that this happens on screen. You've got such unconventional elements. You've got so much like female gaze in this, where it's actually looking at the men, whereas in Bond films it's usually the other way around, not always. And then you've got, as I mentioned it a bit earlier, the main idea, I think, of this film, and it is very difficult to kind of find a theme that runs through this film, but it's that anyone can be James Bond. The fact there are 7 James Bonds and there are 3 men and 4 women who are James Bond kind of upsets that gender imbalance a little bit. And there's the central kind of, if there is a theme, it's that, I think it's probably the tension. I'm probably being a bit generous saying there's a theme to this film, to be honest. But there's a tension between kind of giving into your desires and exercising some kind of self-control. And it's almost like that's what this film is really about. It's kind of like, it's 60s and it's kind of crazy and out there and it's free love, but at the same time it's kind of saying some of those things are a bit wrong and it's kind of a bit repressed in some ways. And I think as a queer person, I think I can sort of relate to that angle. That was the kind of conclusion that I came to. Whether it's, objectively it is not a great film, but there's just so much in there. It's such a rich text if you want to approach it from any kind of quasi-academic standpoint.
I was quite similar in my notes, which I'll get to in a second, but I also give you kudos for knowing the other 2 films off the, directly where Bond meets a man in the toilets. I appreciate you knew them, very quickly.
There are others, but I'm not. People will think I'm obsessed with that as well as castration, so I'm just not going to go there.
There is an interesting thread, though, as you said, like sort of the male insecurity here, and it's interesting because you have like the Bond franchise as a large thing, it's such a cultural force of sort of this, this womanizing character, this kind of alpha male character. And it's interesting how this movie is almost looking at how men could be intimidated by James Bond, and that's sort of an interesting thread that it's examining for comedy. And so much of comedy is driven by insecurity and sort of feelings of inadequacy. So that is kind of interesting, especially when you consider what a mess it is, that thread does carry through in almost every segment, really.
Well, you got to think that there was it 5 directors plus bonus directors thrown in there too? Like, someone must have put something together at some point. So I'm glad that you find that in there, David. Alan, what about you?
Well, I actually watched this time around a couple of days ago in a very different order. There was a note, there was a recent thread on one of the Bond Facebook things about this movie after people had been to see the recent screening at the Prince Charles Theatre. And there was that sparked a thread, and there was an interesting thread. And Raymond Benson put in there, he was like, well, you do know that we talked about the 3-hour edit. Well, even while they were doing the edits, it was like, part of the reason it's a mess is because the studio went in and did their own edit because they wanted Peter Sellers on screen earlier.
Oh, does that explain why
That
he's at that?
explains it.
That pre-credit sequence is so strange because it is
right. So that's why he was in the pre-credit sequence, and that's why a lot of the story is out of order. So Raymond Benson put up, try watching it in this order, and he put up a screening order. And so I thought, I'm going to do that, and I rewatched it in that order, and it makes a lot more sense. And it basically ends up being what we would just more of that portmanteau type thing, because if you watch it in the order that Raymond suggests, you get the David Niven retired Bond story arc. Then you get him recruiting the female spy, which is his daughter, but was originally a separate female spy. And then she goes to the house in Berlin where she finds out about Le Chiffre And then Le Chiffre's blackmail thing fails, so he said, I need to set up a Baccarat game. And then you get the story of the Peter Sellers character being recruited and playing. And then, of course, you get the last 15, 20 minutes when it all goes crazy anyway. But it makes... It just moving these 3 or 4 scenes around, it's like it's a completely different movie. The through line, the narrative through line, and you pick up the fact that there's actually, despite the other directors not supposedly knowing what was happening, there is actually verbal clues in each segment that leads to the next segment. And it works a lot more narratively. And I was like, wow, this is like a completely, just moving these scenes around make it into a completely different movie, which I thought was fascinating because it shows there was, somebody somewhere had some idea of a through line. And how it put together, and it was clearly the edit that really. You talked earlier about them needing an editor, or I think the studio basically went in and butchered whatever edits they put together, just to make sure that the star got more screen time up front. So that was interesting watching it that way. I love the themes that sort of you two have mentioned about, the ideas of anybody can be James Bond, and for me it was also, I think, a lot of wish fulfillment stuff. First time I saw it as a teenager, it's fun, it's sexy, it's got lots of pretty women in it, and you've also got the, as much as I hate Woody Allen, his character of the hero worshipping the uncle and trying to be his uncle, but being cowed by that and trying to figure out how to sort of top his hero in a way, I thought made sense. So I've just sort of, each time I watch it, I find something different, be that either thematically or even just some of the gags, some of the references, some of the Fleming callbacks. There's so many Fleming callbacks in this movie. Mm-hmm. And pretty much every time the one that got me this time, which I don't know why I'd never noticed it in the millions of times I watched before, we were talking about the threat of castration and stuff. When he's torturing Peter Sellers, and Sellers gets up out of the chair, and Orson Welles says, "Oh, don't worry about the chair with the hole in it. The upholsterers are coming in tomorrow." And I just I'd never noticed that line before. But it's a perfect callback to the novel Casino Royale, which if you hadn't read the novel, it wouldn't have meant anything at that point. It would have only been a callback that somebody who'd actually read Fleming would have got. And the movie is just full of so many Fleming callbacks, and of course references to the Connery. I love the lines about that sexual acrobat and his gadget-laden Aston Martin and things. That they're poking fun at the Eon stuff, but they're also poking fun, but actually paying Fleming's source material its due as well, I think, throughout it. So again, a very complex movie that I think you can just, each sitting you can take it in a different way and get different things out of it each time you watch it through, whatever order you watch it in.
That's truly fascinating to me, just to hear about the different order. I'd not stumbled upon that before, and I think we'll put that in the show notes below if we can.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
Just so people can go and check it out that way. We'll get it off of you later, Alan. But it kind of reminds me, if that's the case, this film now begins to remind me of the Avengers from the 90s.
Yeah.
We did a special on that in summer last year. We spoke to the director, we spoke to the film's writer, and that was butchered by the studio in the editing phase. They destroyed it completely. What you get is a mess. And so it begins to beg the question that maybe in this order, as Alan was alluding to, maybe there is a more coherent film in there. It's not so much the fault of the lack of direction, the lack of a good editing style. Maybe it is just that last hurdle where it fell down and was torn to pieces by the studio.
Yeah.
Yeah. We learn something new every day. But Cam, what about you? You were probably the most sour out of the original thoughts. So where do you stand?
I think it says a lot about the state of 2022 and its effect on me. But I sat watching this movie last night, and I don't know that it's ever made more sense to me when I was watching it that I was actually able to follow the narrative and be like, oh, okay, this actually connects. And I began to get very concerned about that because I don't think that speaks to a very healthy state of mind. But nonetheless, I guess that's where I am after. This was my third time watching it last night. I will never, I don't think, love this movie. It's one I find, at the time when this is put out in 1967, this is the second longest Bond movie. Thunderball just beats it by a minute. But that's crazy when you look at the ones that came before it. And to me, this movie always feels very long. And at a certain point, it begins to really drag on me, especially when you get into the Berlin sequences and some of the hallucinogenic stuff, the psychedelic 60s stuff. But what I find interesting about this movie is just, had this movie just been a straightforward spoof of 60s Bond, I don't know that anyone would remember it really or talk about it in an interesting way, because you had the Flint stuff, you had the Mad Helms, you had all these other lesser, maybe known 60s spy spoofs that are all kind of doing the same thing. This movie being this sort of gigantic mess is what makes it interesting and why I think it has this legacy and why we're, in the year 2022 sitting down to talk about it, because it does sort of demand that sort of attention. I remember when I was in postmodern lit in university, we had to cover a book called Piccolo Mondo, and it was a book written by 4 authors, and in the story, every character's name was just a letter, so it was like A or B or C, and every chapter was just written by a different author, and they would only look back at like the last couple of lines or something like that of the chapter before them. And of course, this was written in the 1960s, so it's possibly LSD fueled. It's crazy. It is an experience that you'd say is not a very good story, but is interesting because of the fact it's sort of this time and place and the approach to an artistic, story and what they are doing with that and how they're trying to break kind of the molds of standard storytelling. That's kind of what Casino Royale is. It's a 1960s film. It's clearly made by people that are, embracing that 60s lifestyle. And so, like, in that respect, it's a fascinating movie and one I find very interesting, but it's one I find very just unsatisfying from a storytelling point of view.
Well, I'm going to jump in and say that you 3 are all mad.
You're all you're not going to join the Casino Royale fun movement?
I'm not. I'm not going to join the love fest. I tell you why. I mean, I actually was one of the people who traveled to the PCC to watch it. And it was probably the second time I ever saw it. And watching a film in the cinema is different to watching it at home. Absolutely. You're focused on it completely. There is no phones. There is no dog barking. There's no distractions unless someone's munching popcorn really loudly. And I took my better half, Hannah, who creates the artwork for the show, and she was furious with me that I took her to this film. Absolutely furious that I made her sit through this film. And I just have to I sometimes need to take my Bond and spy film hat off and just remember that, okay, we're all experts. I'm not, but you guys are all experts. And remember that there's a general audience out there. And I think on that level, I think this film is an utter failure.
Yeah.
It just doesn't work.
I mean, my sister, I had a similar experience showing it to my sister because she's a big Bond fan, but she sat through this movie and it was like torture for her just to get through.
Yeah. But it's interesting, in my notes, I wrote down, I underlined the word perspective. And it's interesting that we've all come at this from a different perspective because this film is, to the average movie-going audience, if you put this in cinemas today, I think people would walk out.
Yeah.
I don't think that's a revelation to say. But if you are a scholar of film, or you love Bond, or you just love like dissecting art, you love digging into art, I think there is a very rich tapestry here to look at and to really sort of examine. Because, okay, Thunderball, You Only Live Twice are great films. They both made the knock list. And we're still talking about them now because they're Bond films. But are they really pushing boundaries? Are they really trying something different? Or are they just going off of the Goldfinger script and just adding more money to it? That's a question.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and so I can't say this is a good film. I can't sign off on that. What I can say is this is a very interesting film. And I think this is why I wanted to get us together to talk about it, because there's so much to dig into. Ultimately, you could talk for hours about the film, but I just need to remind myself that on the top of it, there is a cinema goer that would just walk out.
I think that
I agree with you. Sorry, Dave.
No. I was gonna agree with you, but then politely disagree. Go for it, Alan.
Yeah, me too.
Come on.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you for the average cinema goer. If they just come into this cold, today's cinema goer would not got it. A cinema goer in the 60s, 67, that was in the middle of the psychedelic period and Free Love and Sergeant Pepper and all the other stuff that was going on at that time, they would have, a certain generation would have got it. Perhaps some of the older generation wouldn't have. I think like I said, I think my dad just enjoyed it because it had Peter Sellers in it.
Yeah.
But there was a lot of the stuff he didn't get or didn't enjoy about it. But he loved it because it was a Peter Sellers movie. I think there's people who would have gone it go to see it just because of who was in it. Those names don't mean anything to today's cinema goers. People don't go today just to see a Peter Sellers movie. So I think today's audience, I think it would either leave them like your better half, furious or cold or bemused. But I think Cam said it. For me, the one word when people ask me about this movie, I think is the word that Cam just used. It's a fascinating movie. If you've got an interest in film or the arts or Bond, or even you've got an interest in popular history or an interest in the 60s. Somebody actually, because I mentioned I was at my writers group last night, and somebody, I mentioned that we were doing this podcast, and somebody said, well, so what is it about that movie that you like so much? And I'm like, I don't know if like is the right word. It fascinates me. I enjoy it. And it's such a perfect time capsule of the 1960s psychedelic zeitgeist. And that's what it is for me. So do I love it as a movie? No, but I do find it incredibly fascinating. So I totally take your point about perspective, particularly looking at it as a man in the street, woman in the street, just somebody going in cold as a moviegoer in 2020. We would probably be completely thrown off by it. So
I totally agree.
It's an insane ask as well to make a spoof kind of James Bond film that's this long. Like, that to me is insane to do that and expect an audience to really strap themselves in for that. Although, I mean, 60s, it is notable. This was a period where movies got really long. And, you know, as I said, Dr. Dolittle won Best Song that year. Dr. Dolittle is almost 3 hours long, if not 3 hours long. And that was kind of that bloated Hollywood period. So I guess maybe at the time, something this long wouldn't have raised as many eyebrows. But looking at it now, I'm like, this is insane that this movie is this long.
Yeah, I remember going to the movies back then, and I expected the movie to have an intermission.
I think all movies would be improved with an intermission.
Intermission, yeah.
No doubt.
An
about
overture
that.
and an intermission, but yeah. But so for something to run 2 hours was probably, okay.
I take your point, but I'm curious now because David had a retort for me, and I want to hear it.
Yeah, so when a film we've all seen really long films that actually feel really short. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we've all seen really short films that feel really long. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I've read bits and pieces about this, but this is kind of mostly my own conclusion, so it might not be right, but I have a theory that if a film is really long but kind of feels long but we're with it, it's usually because it's spectacle. I've never seen Dr. Dolittle, but I love those kind of big overblown musical type things. You know, there's always that bit, like with a Shakespeare play, around the kind of 4/5 of the way through where it's like, just get to the end, please. And then it kind of picks up. And then the other side is, you know, most Western cinema, at least, not all cinema, but most Western cinema is based on cause and effect. Something happens in one scene, it then leads on to the next scene, and then that leads on to the next scene, and that leads on to the next scene. Now, based on what Alan said about the re-edit that he heard about from Raymond Benson, it sounded like this film may have had more of a kind of cause and effect structure, but it was always going to be kind of slightly disconnected, almost like extended vignettes sort of thing. And that's the sort of thing which makes something feel long when there isn't that clear thread from scene to scene to scene to scene. I mean, there are such bizarre like edits. I mean, the most jarring, which you've already mentioned, is when Peter Sellers gets in the race car and then zooms off the screen. You never find out what happens, and the next moment he's strapped to a chair. So there's no cause, there's no relationship between those scenes at all. And it's those moments, because they take such... It actually hurts our brains. You know, as you probably know, I work in education. And so I have to look at the best way to design learning sequences. And the best way to design a learning sequence is you require minimal mental effort to get from one place to another. This film requires massive mental effort. Your brain hurts so much watching this movie. If you're prepared to go with this movie, you have to sit there, and it's one of those bizarre ironies that a film which is supposedly kind of fun and frothy and whatever, if you're actually going to get the most enjoyment from this film, you know, strap yourself in for an intellectual kind of marathon, because your brain has to make those connections between all the different bits and pieces. It's exhausting watching this movie.
Can I actually just give you a quote that I got when I was doing the research from somebody on a response on a part of that Facebook thread? It actually said, if you're trying to make sense of Casino Royale, that's not the way to enjoy it.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember when I saw it the first time, I was infuriated by, actually, it was a Sellers scene, but it was actually his death scene where he's gunned down by Vesperland. I remember just being completely baffled as to what I was even seeing at that point. And you're right, like, it's a movie where you have to sit there and do the mental exercise connecting scene to scene, because they'll have characters toss off just like kind of a line or two, but it's the like creakiest of connective tissue. It's like, okay, if I basically take that line and extrapolate from there, I can understand how we get to this scene. That's kind of what you have to do, which is an interesting choice in a comedy, because so much of comedy is built on setup, payoff, setup, payoff. This movie very frequently, as a comedy, doesn't have the setups and is just a series of punchlines, but you're like, wait, I don't know what the joke was.
Or it has some of the longest setups, like the stutter setup, the gag with the stutter.
Yeah.
I mean, they run that for, 5-6 minutes before you actually get the payoff. Just to David's point about that scene from the race car to the capture, that's actually one of the scenes that never got filmed. Which is why you've got that horrendous jump cut, because the explanation of how he got captured was never filmed because they'd lost Peter Sellers by that point. So,
which makes total sense, and we have to remember that this film went through, as Cam pointed out, trials and tribulations in terms of putting it together. So I think what we'll do now is talk about things that we liked for a little bit. So I'll just pick one thing each. So I'll throw it to you first, Alan. What's something you really like about this film?
Cool. There's lots of things. I just, at the end of the day, I think I joined the Casino Royale fun movement when I was 15. I just find it fun. Yes, it's got problems. Yes, it's got issues. Yes, it's got a weird backstory. But I just enjoy watching it once every couple of years. I just find it a fun movie. Maybe I've just got a weird sense of humor, but I just enjoy it as a fun movie.
Well, is there any segment in the film that really stands out to you as like just the perfect kind of moment within the movie, or something like, is there, because obviously we have these various directors doing different sections. Is there one that jumps out to you more so than the others?
I actually like the introduction of Martha Bond.
Yeah.
I think that's I think it's a beautifully choreographed thing, but and it still makes me laugh, is the one where she actually asks the guy who's with the fan at the back of him, do you speak English, or do you understand English? And he goes, no. And then they're like, oh, okay. And then they carry on talking about their secret mission in English. I don't know why. Just that one throwaway line just cracks me up every time I hear it. So, I like that introduction of the Martha Bond sequence, and how uncomfortable Sir James Bond is about introducing himself.
I mean, just to speak towards the Martha Bond intro, I mean, it's interesting because we spoke about Mata Hari like 2 years ago at this point. It's nice to see a Mata Hari connection come back. But comparing the dances between that and Greta Garbo, I think Casino Royale wins. Far more money spent on it.
Well, I mean, yeah, just the filmmaking in that introduction scene is really fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
Like, honestly, it's a sort of sequence that's so strong, you're like, boy, they should have just done a separate movie about that. Like, just make that the focus, do like a 90-minute, just crazy psychedelic Mata Bond story. I would watch that.
It does go to show people who think that you can't, but you can tell a story with a female protagonist in the James Bond universe. Doesn't have to be led by a guy.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah.
I'm still waiting for that Wei Lin movie.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special report.
Agents, pardon the interruption, but we have some top secret intel.
That's right. Independent podcasting is not cheap. Equipment, hosting, research. We don't have Townsend Agency resources.
And also, we don't want to run ads on the show. No one wants to hear that shit, Tucky mushrooms. And this is a big reason we created the Spy Hards Patreon.
So we're here asking for your help. Please consider joining the Patreon. You'll not only be gaining access to our exclusive lineup of reviews and film commentaries, but also helping support the show. We're currently saving to upgrade our sound equipment to bring your listening experience up to Q Branch standards.
With a wide range of flexible options and an ever-growing catalogue to dive into. Become a true Spy Hard today and enter the Xander Zone at patreon.com/spyhards. That's SPYHARDS, or you can find a link in the show notes below. Now, Cam, on with the spy jinx. But, David, what about you? Something you liked?
Okay, I'm going to be quick, I promise, but 3 things. I've had to go. There are lots, like Alan, there are so many bits of this movie. My favourite segment in the whole film is the Berlin sequence.
Yes.
It's very Dr. Cabinet of Caligari, Caligari, German expressionist kind of visually. But I love the I've forgotten the actress's name, but the person who plays Frau Hoffner. You are quite insane. It's like that exchange just seems to kind of typify the entire movie for me. It's kind of that backwards logic sort of thing. And it ends with Richard Wattis, I love that actor in Carry On movies. And actually he was born literally about 5 minutes from where I'm sitting right now, in the UK. And that kind of fussy British actor, obviously gay, but played those sorts of fussy man from the Ministry type character. I love that sequence. The second one, Deborah Karr. I mean, I love Deborah Karr in anything.
Yes.
But Deborah Karr in this film is just off the actual scale. That whole explanation she gives, which God knows what 7-year-old me thought of this, but that whole explanation she gives, and it's so sexually kind of provocative and coded, all of that sequence with Deborah Karr. But she's talking about the backstory of this family, like hundreds of years ago, that there was a succession of rapes that happened and whatever. And it's just like, oh my God, this is so horrible. But at the same time, the way she's delivering all those lines is just like so matter-of-factly. You just think, whoa. So God knows what 7-year-old me thought of all that kind of stuff. And the last thing is just a single line of dialogue that never fails to make me laugh out loud, which is when Peter Sellers with Jacqueline, who will be on your podcast soon, says, my goodness, so he's been drugged with the champagne, my goodness, this is strong shampoo. And it's just the way he says shampoo rather than champagne, which even as a 7-year-old made me laugh, and it still makes me laugh today.
When I heard that shampoo line the first time, I thought it was because it was like they didn't have a time to reshoot. Like it was like an off cut, and that's all they had to work with, and he just flubbed his lines.
Right. I wanted to just mention it was Anna Quayle played Frau Hoffner.
That's it.
Yeah,
she's amazing.
Yeah, and she's great. Yeah, I mean, just the art direction of that whole sequence is unbelievable too. The performances in this are just so. You can say the movie's a complete disaster, and I think part of the problem is a lot of characters don't interact with each other, like because it's segmented. You don't have that kind of flow of characters. But you can't say that everyone who's showing up isn't committed to the cause. Like, I mean, Peter Sellers obviously had a lot of personal issues, but the performance comes across in the movie, and everyone else feels like they're kind of, I don't know if they're on the same page, but they're all conjuring up a weird energy that somehow all meshes together fairly well.
I mean, just to talk about that Germany sequence, the Berlin sequence, I should say, beautifully staged. Like, again, it's like another episodic part of this film that really works for me. It's one of my favorite parts. And part of the thing that works for me in that scene is it just feels like it's a Monty Python sketch.
Yeah,
like it's just absolute comedy at times, especially when they're doing the auction. And this is it just feels like a skit out of Monty Python's Flying Circus, and that's really what works for me, especially with the chap who's saying, "Oh, there's some sort of a war on."
That's Richard Wattis.
That's Richard Wattis. Brilliant. Yeah. All of that scene where, and he's like, they're asking him how they're going to bid, and some are standing, some are sitting down, and then the one British guy's like, either way, I don't know, and that just, that never fails to crack me up, much like David. But Cam, what's something you liked?
The opening credits remind me a lot of Monty Python as well with the animation. I just kept thinking of that. So, Scott, you may know better. Where was Monty Python at this point in 1967?
Flying Circus was on the air.
Okay.
I think I will double check, but yeah, that's all they. I mean, they had done radio stuff around the same sort of time. But yeah, Flying Circus was on the air.
Because I do wonder if there was a Python influence going on throughout this movie, just because it's out there in the pop culture landscape.
Actually, just to correct myself, Monty Python's Flying Circus didn't start until '69 and continued on to '73. So this is pre Terry Gilliam's art style. Wonderful stuff though. That credit sequence. Good shout, Cam.
It would not shock me if Terry Gilliam was a big fan of this movie. Honestly,
that would make perfect sense. He
Yeah.
probably understands it. Actually, he's probably the only man who gets it.
So are we saying Casino Royale was a cultural trailblazer and influenced so much that followed, including the Eon Bond series?
I would say so. There's a lot of things in this movie that was picked up in the Bond movies, or even talking about spoofs, Austin Powers, the Fembots. I mean,
Oh yeah.
clearly from here, a lot of Austin Powers. You know, when we did the Derek Flint thing, we talked about how Austin Powers was, to a large extent, a remake of Derek Flint. Well, if you also throw in some Goldfinger and a large proportion of this movie into the mix that made up Austin Powers, and as you said, there's a lot of things that got, you know, the strong female protagonist is in here first. Female 007 first in here.
Money Penny on a Mission.
Yeah.
Money Penny on a Mission. Yeah. And also just the number of people who were in this movie who had already been in the Eon productions or went on to be in the Eon productions. There is a large amount of people who were both in Eon productions and in Casino Royale 67. There was a massive cast in this movie.
The whole Angels of Death sequence in Honor Majesties, which I love, with obviously, you know, him playing queer-coded Hilary Bray and having people feel up his legs below the table. That is basically ripped from this movie.
That really jumped out.
Because that's not in the Fleming novel. So, you know, Bond working his way through the Angels of Death, that's essentially what happens in Casino Royale 67 in the sequence with David Niven and Deborah Karr.
And funnily enough, one of the people in the Scottish castle is in the Angels of Death. There you go.
Yeah, Angela Scolar, is that how you pronounce her surname?
Yeah, his bath time thermometer in this one is Ruby Bartlett on Her Majesty's Secret Service.
Yes,
Yes.
there you go. From Cam, did you give us a like?
No, I haven't. For me, I just want to talk about just the visuals of this movie. The art direction was credited to three people, Ivor Beddoes, Lionel Couch, and John Howell. And I think just the set decoration of this movie is unbelievable. It's so beautiful. I unfortunately only have the DVD version here. There's not like a really decent, affordable Blu-ray option in North America. It's just not a movie that's, I don't know, like, Alan, do you know of any decent Blu-ray version?
Mine's the German edition.
Yeah.
No, I like you. I have the DVD. I've never found a Blu-ray over here. So.
I have the same version as David.
Yeah, not a lot of love for it over on these shores. And so, like, I would love to just watch the visuals of this movie and the set deck. Like, there is, like, the scene with all the tigers and everything, the stuffed tigers, or even the M's Manor with all the animal heads on the walls and all that. The big villain lairs, you know, the Smersh headquarters. Everything looks unbelievable and very, very expensive. And even just, like, throwaway moments. I think of when you have Peter Sellers and Ursula Andress. And there's like the scene where it's the look of love kind of montage where they're walking and the fish tank is in the foreground. Looks so beautiful. Or a moment where she is, for some reason that I could never explain, jumping on the bed in slow motion with feathers flying all around. I'm like, I don't have any idea what's going on at the moment, but it looks incredible. So like just from a visual sense, this movie is so accomplished and so beautiful. You could take so many shots of this and put them up on the One Perfect Shot social media account, although I don't know if they'd get that many likes, but nonetheless, you could totally do it. And also, just another like for me I want to throw in, I think Orson Welles is an absolute blast here. From what it sounds like, he insisted that he do his own magic act in the movie. Wise call. I'm on board for it. Orson Welles is always someone who's just magnetic to watch, and I love watching him here.
I think he's a great Lashif.
Yeah, he's great. Yeah. He's a great actor.
Yeah, true. I've got two that I wanted to shout out that we haven't had yet. Cam kind of brushed on my first one, but I genuinely think Peter Sellers made a good Bond. Like in kind of a man growing into the role. sort of way. Like, I would like to have seen the full film with him. There's that moment where the scene where he's actually with Jacqueline Bisset, and he's got the gun out. He's playing it straight. It's not really much comedy in the scene, and he shoots the champagne bottle, but he looks the part. And I want to see more of what would have been with Peter Sellers. I think it's a shame that we didn't get that. But I think he actually, in the stuff he's in, is really good.
Yeah.
And the other thing I want to talk about, which we brushed on earlier, is the soundtrack. As Cam said, Look of Love, first Bond song to get an Oscar nod, didn't win it. But just the rest of the score itself, from the credit sequence to the at Casino Royale song, is just a ton of fun. And I think in moments where the film is losing itself in terms of plot, you can always fall back to the visuals and the soundtrack.
The soundtrack is just superb, and that's one of the things I do find, that people who don't like the movie still adore the soundtrack, particularly in the Bond community. I see so many people say, and just it has that reputation outside of the Bond community as being one of the best movie soundtracks written. And I know a lot of audiophiles use it as like a test bed for audio systems and stuff like that, because just of the range it's got in it.
There was one of those James Bond challenges online recently, and they challenged people to pick the top 4 cues, and one of mine was from this film. It's the Moneypenny Goes for Broke, where she's interviewing all of them, which is such an amazing kind of gender reversal, where a woman gets to effectively kind of work her way through a bunch of men. Imagine that in an Eon Bond film. It's always the other way around. But the music for that sequence is, obviously I find that sequence absolutely hilarious, but the music for that really makes it.
What's interesting is, like, the Bond franchise seemed to, and I mean, like, the quote-unquote unofficial Bonds, whatever you want to call them, always seem to struggle to find a musical identity. You look at Never Say Never Again, and it's, it doesn't know what to do as compared to those Eon films. Whereas I feel like this movie had a very clear sense musically as to what to do, and I think holds together beautifully. And it didn't get an Oscar nom for score, but had it gotten that nomination, I would have totally understood why. Yeah, I think it's very strong.
I just want to take us back to something David just brought up, which is the anti-female spy device.
Ah,
yeah.
This is really just a question for Cam, but gents, if you have seen the film, feel free to chirp in. But Cam, did you get major throwbacks to My Favorite Spy?
I try not to.
We didn't get any pantyhose rolling up the leg or anything like that, unfortunately.
No.
But the whole checking how they're kissing was actually done by Bob Hope in the 50s.
That's true. It's true.
Yeah, Bob Hope did it first, folks. But we've spoken a lot already about dislikes, so maybe we won't dwell on it too much. But I'll just go around everyone again. Maybe just something, even if it's a tidbit, but just something you maybe disliked about the film you wanted to discuss. Let's go with Alan first.
I think it's the gratuitous cameos in the last 15 minutes. The Georgia Raft and
Jean-Paul Belmondo.
Thank you. Struggling there, yeah. Who basically can't even translate his own language. Med does not mean ouch.
That's very true.
So yeah, those, particularly as they have them in the trailer, and as much as in the trailer is pretty much their entire scene in the movie. For me it's those gratuitous 2 cameos, I think, sort of throw me out for a while. So
I find a lot of the cameos in this movie, like, they didn't find them things that were particularly fun to do. Like, when you have a great cameo, you want it to really pop. Like, everyone goes, oh my God, do you remember that moment when so-and-so showed up and did this?
Yeah.
And you more walk out of this one going, that was weird when that person showed up. Like, the whole Peter O'Toole appearance for me is kind of a head scratcher. And yeah, the ones you mentioned in the finale, it's like, okay. And even William Holden, like, huge star. John Huston, so exciting to see him in the movie, but like, they don't contribute anything that's interesting.
Yeah, at least William Holden and John Huston have a bit to do with driving the narrative at the beginning.
Yeah.
And the Peter O'Toole thing, I think basically he was on set and the two of them were drinking buddies, and it's like, do you want to be in this scene? So I don't know.
Speaking of, I just want to briefly ask a question that has tormented my sister and I for a while. Maybe, Alan or David, one of you can answer this. So there's the scene where Mata Bond is escaping, and there's the manhole, and she pulls it off, and it plays the "What's New, Pussycat." And I'm reminded of that because Peter O'Toole, of course, there's a, obviously tie-in with that movie. Does anyone understand that joke? Because I watched What's New, Pussycat hoping to understand that manhole joke, and I still don't get it.
I think it was just an inside nudge, wink, wink to the studio and the production team, that a callback to their last success. It's like, here's a little connection between that movie and this, because it's the same stars, it's the same movie, it's the same production studio. It's a bit like in From Russia with Love, when Eon changed the Niagara Marilyn Monroe movie poster for Call Me Joanna. I think it's just an in-house joke within the production company studio. So
it's just such a weird one, because they are reacting to that song as in, nope, we're not going down there. I'm like, okay.
They know how bad that movie is. They don't want to go anywhere near it. That's why.
Fair point.
We did also get the Bernard Cribbins cameo in that sequence, and I will always love Bernard Cribbins. So any chance to see him on screen was fun. Okay, who's next for a dislike? David.
I'm not sure I can actually... Oh, look at me being, diplomatic as usual. But I'm going to go for one that always makes me feel a bit kind of ambivalent, if not a bit queasy. It's a very small character in the film, played by the actor John Wells. Anyone know which Eon Bond film John Wells appears in?
Racking my brain.
In this film, he plays Fordyce, who is the assistant to Q. Now,
he's at the end of For Your Eyes Only when he plays Dennis Thatcher.
That's it. He plays Dennis Thatcher in For Your Eyes Only as well. So, so Fordyce is what we call a sissy character, which is a gay character who's rendered harmless by being sexually neutral. So I think like these probably the closest. And again, I'm not sure the dates. I think John Inman appeared in Open All Hours. It's not Open All Hours. No, what's the one with the department store? Is it Open All Hours?
Oh
no, that I'm mixing it up, aren't I? The sitcom anyway, where it's in a department store. Are You Being Served? That's it. Are You Being Served? Yeah. So he plays a sissy character. John Inman, the actor, played a sissy character in that, and John Inman was gay. John Wells wasn't gay, but he's playing that character, and he's kind of measuring. It's very. If anyone knows the Fast Show, it's very Suits You, Sir, and all that sort of thing. So seeing those sorts of characters in films always makes me feel a bit uncomfortable for kind of queer representation. But being as this film is so brilliant in other ways in terms of queer representation, I can sort of forgive it. The one part of that scene that I always find rankles, and it's not this film's fault, it's actually Octopussy's fault, is when Q takes the Mickey out of the gadgetry in the Eon series, because when Peter Sellers picks up the pen and he says he's about to say good for writing poison pen letters, and then Q turns around and says, yes, usually it's something like, when I'm paraphrasing, but when people say that, that's when you say now's the time to leave MI5. So it's like they're saying this joke about poison pen letters is really naff in 1967, and yet in 1983 the Eon series used that joke without irony, and that always takes me out of the movie because I'm thinking they're lampooning something that won't happen for another 16 years, if that makes sense. I've watched this film too many times, haven't I?
Well, I have to ask now, if we're talking about the Q scene all of a sudden, and I do agree, that character is a bit of a strange turn, but the film does better in other in other situations. But it's kind of an early glimpse into the absurd world of a Q branch office. We haven't really had that much absurdity yet, as far as I remember.
No, you're right, actually. I think the most insane thing we'd seen was actually not a Q scene, but a Spectre Island, in From Russia with Love, which was kind of kooky. But you are right, like we hadn't gotten to the full-on extended Q's gadget sequences you would really get in the Moore films.
Or the Brosnans.
Yeah, I think the only time we'd seen Q's lab at this point was Goldfinger.
Yeah.
because on the others he'd been out in the field. He'd been to either the Bahamas or Japan in the other ones. So yeah.
Well, that begs the question then: what is the most absurd Q gadget in this film?
Oh my god!
I mean, you've got the bowler hat that has a gun in it. That's a strange one. You've got the James Bond toadstool, patent pending. I'm not sure what that is used for. The bulletproof armor with a Geiger counter in it.
That's always necessary.
Of course, it comes in different colors. Okay. The TV watch, which Bond would bring back later on with Roger Moore.
I mean, honestly, like all of these gadgets seem completely feasible in a world where, like, you know, Roger Moore Bond has like the rope that climbs in Octopussy and things like that, like, or the umbrella that snaps people up like a Venus flytrap. I don't know. All those gadgets seem to me more like spoof material than what we're seeing in this movie.
Yeah, that's very fair. Okay, well then, Cam, what about you? What's a dislike you have?
Well, I just want to just briefly say, like, there's a lot of Sellers material that hasn't aged well. There's a lot of, shall we say, racist impressions. The movie has a few of those. Also, there's like the scene with the agent they're training, where there's the quote unquote like Chinese agent, I guess, and he's like saying sayonara to her and things like that. It's like that, not great. So that's one thing, obviously, that's aged this movie very poorly, but. In terms of, like, I think for me, one of the frustrations is, like, if you had a little more interconnected character stuff, I think this could work a lot better. It's the fact that, like, it really does hit these, like, barriers where characters just vanish that makes it feel like it's lurching from place to place. And I think if you managed to iron that out just a little more, it would have flowed, because, like, the introduction of the Deborah Karr character, where you have just Bond showing up and we have a spy posing as M's widow. And it's like, there is like no setup for this whatsoever. And I find it very confusing. And I just think, like, it's elements like that. The movie may not be a masterpiece if you had it, but it would make a lot more sense to people. And I think that's one of the biggest things that makes this movie frustrating. And one of the biggest things that drags it down for viewers who don't have the appreciation, you know, for the Bond universe that they can bring to it, is that it's like, it doesn't play like a film that they would watch. Like, films have typically character arcs, stories that carry you through, connected characters, and this movie just doesn't have those.
Do you think that the instability in identity is something that makes it kind of, I don't know, I obviously I go in with a very biased kind of pair of lenses on, and instability and identity is what my website's all about.
Yeah.
You know, kind of like people trying to find their way in the world. I mean, the classic is that when I rewatched it yesterday in preparation for today, I'd forgotten, even though I'd written about it before, that Martha Bond is not necessarily actually Sir James's daughter. In other scenes, she's referred to as his goddaughter, and that just shows a bit of a mismatch between the different people writing and directing the film. And because he makes some kind of almost like, if it is his daughter, they're really awkwardly, like, almost incestuous comments to her. And then
there's a quote I wrote down that she says to him. If you weren't my dad, I could fancy you. That's it.
Yeah. And he's talking about the size of her breasts in a slightly later scene.
Yeah, that she has much more formidable weapons than her mother had, or something.
That's it. And it's like, I mean, in that sense, this film is, and you're right, with Deborah Karr, it's like she's now playing M's widow. So who was she playing before? Everyone seems to be playing a role. I mean, and then you've got that, you know, because I fixate on the Deborah Karr scenes in this movie. You've got the scene where she's escaping from the castle down the drain pipe, and it's obviously a man in kind of drag. Yeah, it's an amazing stunt. Not taking anything away, and that just speaks to kind of the dearth of female stunt people back in 1967, that they possibly couldn't find anybody. But it's every kind of scene of this film, even individual scenes, kind of like you never really can pin down who the characters are. That's what I find fascinating about it. But I can understand why people get mega frustrated with it.
I'm still confused. Are M's daughters also spies?
Yeah. Well, to me, they're not M's daughters. They're just control.
Okay.
They're not actually M's daughters. They're members of whatever it is, control or authority. See, they also kept moving that around. Is with the bad guy Smirsh, and then they talked about authority and control, and I don't know, but to me they were agents of that group. So and interestingly as well, several of those girls ended up in that scene because they filmed the crazy casino scene was one of the first things that he filmed. And they basically went out and found all these models in London to populate the casino floor, and then they picked out them to be M's daughters. So you actually, if you look really carefully, you can actually see some of M's daughters are actually in the final casino scene because they actually filmed that first. So like Alexandra Bastedo, and I think Jacqueline, maybe you can, if you haven't already asked her, I think she's in the final scene as well.
She is, yeah.
And then was picked up to be Miss Goodthighs earlier on. So yeah, there's quite a few people in that final scene who shouldn't be there because they've actually been in earlier in the movie.
And it's weird because like she's in the frame, Jacqueline Bisset, and then a scene later she's got her thighs out with Peter Sellers. Strange.
Yeah.
But then again, this film is full of strange.
I think the thing that fascinates me about this film is like, when do we get to the point where something tips over into spoof? So I was looking at some of the contemporary reviews from 1971 of Diamonds Are Forever, and it was widely accepted. You know how much I love that movie, and I love the underdog Bond movies, which is probably why I love this one so much. But at that time, that film was critically really well received, even though a lot of critics said James Bond has tipped into spoof territory. So at what point does James Bond tip into spoof territory? Because, and Alan mentioned this earlier, there's so many Fleming bits of this. You know, the Sir James at the start of the movie is probably I'm going to go there, you know, might be a bit provocative, but it's possibly the closest cinematic incarnation we actually have of Fleming's Bond. Because you can totally imagine him retiring and living, you know, trying to fill his days, because he's got Fleming's Aki D, and he's kind of trying to fill his days with all these pursuits that he doesn't really find fascinating at all. And he's developing a stammer because he's not kind of, you know, in the zone. And obviously Fleming, you know, David Niven was one of his favourite picks for Bond. He even gets mentioned in the novel If You Only Live Twice. And yeah, it's like I find as I'm watching, I'm kind of like, is this really actually quite Fleming-like compared with what we ended up with on the screen from Eon?
Yeah, I think so. I think you make a very good point. And David Niven also tried to actually buy the rights to do a Bond TV show at one point from Fleming, but couldn't. So yeah, I think he is probably, as you said, closest to Fleming's vision. And if you look at Fleming's Hoagie Carmichael description, or that famous sketch that he had made of what Bond should look like, it's a lot closer to David Niven than probably any other actor who's ever had the role. So I think he's probably closest to what Fleming had in his mind. Yeah, I think it's a good point.
I've always struggled more with just the visual of David Niven because, like, I think, like, in terms of look, yes, I think he actually totally would have been a good Bond. But growing up, I was so exposed to him as a comedic actor. Like, I just saw him in endless Disney comedies and stuff that I've always struggled to imagine him bringing kind of that serious spy version to the screen. I'm sure he could do it. He was a fabulous actor, but it's always been a bit of a block for me.
Have you ever seen Raffles when he was a younger man?
No, I haven't.
I'd recommend that to people because you can sort of see why Fleming liked the idea of him as Bond. He's kind of like this gentleman thief, kind of an anti-hero type character. Yeah.
Okay, I'll check that out.
Or a matter of life and death, where he's an RAF pilot.
Oh my god, that film!
One of my all-time favorite movies.
Same.
So check out that if you've not seen it.
Well, speaking of Disney films, I'm going to talk about one of my dislikes really quickly. Listeners may know I do not like the film One of Our Dinosaurs is Missing. This film has a connection to that film and to The Liquidator, and that is Mr. Derek Nemo. Because he is back once again in this film to ruin it for me, because I get pulled right back to 1975. I love that there's this spy world that he is in. He's in 3 spy movies, 2 in the 60s. The Liquidator is 2 years before this, I think. So I'm probably going to write some sort of memoir for him at some point about how he had his life in the spy realm. I just think that it has some hilarity in it. But whenever I see him, his spies are all the same. They all talk like this. And it's so bizarre seeing him on screen. It does bump me. But the only other thing I had for dislikes, and I think we probably can all agree on this, is, well, it's interesting when you're writing down something that happens in a Bond film, that there isn't many times that you can write down the following sentence: the horse guard takes Matter Bond onto a UFO.
Yeah. I was actually, I think, more confused by her changing haircut than I was by the spaceship at that point.
Yeah, that is true. But like that, the last, say, 20 minutes of this film, when we go into the bizarre casino battle royale, if you'll pardon the pun, and like the UFO abduction and the stuff in the Smersh headquarters with Jimmy Bond / Dr. Noah and Frankenstein walking around. The film has given up trying to make sense, and it's just kind of just going with the vibe of it and just having some fun, which is absolutely fine. But for people who are trying to watch this film, it feels like it has just given up on trying to explain anything to you, and it's tough to watch, I would say.
By the way, the Frankenstein, Dave Prowse in his first on-screen movie appearance.
Mm-hmm.
Which there's a whole story behind that too, but I won't go into that because we've been on long enough. But
well, I think before we wrap up, then, has anyone got any final notes?
I have a question I want to ask people. Do you think this movie, in some ways, has aged better because of how much the pop culture now knows Casino Royale 2006? And that you can now watch this movie knowing the plot outline, so you can kind of connect the dots better with things like the Vesper kidnapping and whatever. Do you think that movie maybe has helped this one become a little bit, maybe just slightly more coherent?
I don't think so.
You don't think so?
I think it might have actually done the opposite, because everyone knows who Vesper Lind is, and she's this criminal mastermind who was eaten by her own robotic shark in order to escape being captured, if I remember correctly. So, which also was nicked in Octopussy with the crocodile swallowing Bond. You know, I've literally got a list of about 25 things that the Eon series nick from this film. And yeah, I just think it probably makes it even more incomprehensible. That's my take anyway.
Yeah, because you're trying to compare it to a film that actually works.
Yeah.
Basically. Yeah, I don't think so, Cam.
Okay.
No, I was going to say, I think I agree with David. It might have had the opposite, because people will go in, they'll see the title and they'll go in with certain expectations, which this film will not meet at all. So.
I have one final note, which is I was keeping track of the animal appearances in this, and I started giving them names because I was losing my mind. So we've got James Bark, because we have the dog. We've got SEAL Team 007. Which I'm quite proud of. And then we have the original concept of Dr. No as the monkey turns up.
That's right. Yeah, with the toupee. I did laugh at that chimp, yeah.
Yeah. So there's probably more animals I've forgotten about in this film that I should give names to. But yeah, shout out to
Tiger Rug.
What's that?
Don't forget the Tiger Rug.
Oh, of course, the tiger. What's a Bond
and
pun?
the lions.
Yes.
And the lions.
Oh, we need the lion pun for Bond now. I can't.
Lions to kill?
Oh.
Oh.
That's a rough one.
That one's sweaty.
Pull
That's
up,
sweaty.
Cam. Pull up. Well, okay, gents. I think it's time we answer the question that we always answer on this show. Is Casino Royale 67 making the knock list, or is it going somewhere incredibly hot? David, you're up first.
Oh no! Why did you pick me first? I have endless love for this movie, and I almost don't want to categorize it in any way. Like, it's not a spy movie, it's not a comedy, it's its own thing. It's just bizarre. So to be honest, even though I love this film, I don't think it kind of meets your criteria for the knock list. If we're creating a canon of spy movies, I'm not sure it really fits in there, to be honest.
But it's going on your knock list.
Oh, it's on my list, obviously.
Of course. Okay, so we've got one no so far, but it is all to play for. Alan, you're up next.
Yeah, I'm with David. As much as I find this movie fascinating and rewatch it over and over and always find things to enjoy it, is it a good spy movie? No, it's not on the knock list. But it is. I think David's right. It stands out. It stands on its own. As an event, I think it's what was the 60s word? It was a happening. So
Okay, it's still all to play for, I guess. Cam, what have you got?
Scott, you know me pretty well. I'm not a party guy. And this movie is a very long party. So I like to sit there and admire some of the sights and sounds of this movie. I think it has interesting things about it, but it's just... I don't even know that I can say that this is a movie. It's almost like something more than that because it's not even following the rules of what a standard movie would be for people who are watching it. And it's also not art house enough to stand out as like an art film. It's just this weird in-between thing, and so it's a movie that I think is interesting for film lovers, Bond scholars, people really fascinated with that world to dive into, but something that's on the knock list, not a chance. I think like Our Man Flint was a better representative on the knock list in terms of like the 60s post-Bond kind of spy craze stuff than this is.
Yeah, okay. I love this part because it means my vote means nothing, so I'm going to vote yes. Because screw you all. I'm kidding. I couldn't allow this on the knock list. It's an interesting film. It's a curio, I've heard it referred to as, but it's just too episodic to make sense. And I think if you put a normal man off the street in front of this film, they would pull their hair out. And I've got not much left. So yeah, it's a no from me, which makes 4 no's. And as such, Casino Royale 67 is not making the knock list. But Cam, I do have to ask you a quick question. Is it making another list?
I don't think so. No,
Okay.
It's too interesting.
Okay. All right. We'll leave it there. You guys at home will know what we're talking about. If you think it should make that list, let us know. But gents, I want to thank you both for joining us. Alan first, where can people find more from you?
First off, thank you for having me on to talk about Casino Royale 67. I happily talk about this movie over and over any opportunity I get, as some of my friends know all too well. So thanks for that. And you can find me on Twitter at Bond Lexicon, and as I mentioned earlier, the James Bond Lexicon.online website.
And I'd also recommend the James Bond Lexicon book. I've got a copy myself. I've yet to get Alan to sign it, but I will make that happen one day. And it's that book you grab when you need to know something about Bond. So that's how it works for me. I would definitely recommend it.
Well, thank you.
David, what about you?
Yeah, also a massive fan of Alan's book. I appeared on the Really 007 podcast when it was released, and I accidentally bought 2 copies of it as well, so I gave one away as a competition prize. So, but as for me, you can find the kind of central hub is licensedtoqueer.com, and then it's also on Twitter and Instagram, and there's a podcast version of selected episodes as well. It's not just me. As I said at the top of the show, it's about something around the lines of 15 other people, and, growing all the time. So if you're interested in kind of sharing your own queer points of view on Bond, please don't hesitate to get in touch. I'm always after some new perspectives.
And you had that fantastic video you did with Calvin Dyson about the history of queer characters in Bond. That
was a lot of fun.
Yeah, we loved that video, and we actually linked to it when we did our Diamonds Are Forever review, and I recommend people check that out for sure.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Alan. Thank you, David, both for joining us. And that was our chat on Casino Royale 67. We finally ticked that Bond off of our list, Cam.
That's right. It's one that's been looming over us, and I've always been terrified to tackle it. I think we did a decent job. I'm happy with it.
I'm happy with it too, and I'm glad we got the interview with Jacqueline Bissett to kind of give her perspective on it later in the week. So do tune in on Friday for that. But next week, Cam, what are we talking about?
We're actually bouncing from comedy to comedy. We are tackling the 2009 Coen Brothers film, Burn After Reading.
I am a Coen noob, as it were. I think I've seen one. I've seen Lebowski, and I have seen Burn After Reading before, which is a nice change of pace for us, where I've never seen anything. So I do have a bit of a story with it. So that'll be interesting, and we do have a great guest joining us as well.
That's right. I think I am a pretty big Coen Brothers fan, and Burn After Reading has an interesting place in my memory versus I haven't done my rewatch yet, so I'm interested to see how my rewatch affects my opinion on this one.
Well, there you go. Your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to check out Burn After Reading and join us next week. Now, of course, Casino Royale 67 didn't make the knock list, but if you want to find out the films that did, go to letterboxd.com/spyhards, where you can find out more. And do not forget to follow us discreetly on social media at Spyhards. That's SPYHARDS on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. But until next week, listeners,
To the Laird!
Hello, my name is Chris Karr, I'm a filmmaker and podcaster. Join me as I take a look at the world of espionage, terrorism, geopolitics and organised crime on my podcast, Secrets and Spies, available on all podcast apps.
This is manna from spy heaven.